So as you know, Ash Wednesday is just around the corner, so I thought we would talk about the season of Lent now, just to give you time to think about it, to allow the spirituality of Lent to percolate in the back of your mind before the season of Lent actually begins. And to kind of kick things off, I want to begin with a somewhat provocative statement. It might sound false, but it's actually true. When it comes to the season of Lent, there's actually no canonical requirements to do prayer, fasting, or almsgiving. You don't find it in canon law, it's not a precept of the church. So obviously the question is, what do you do with that? Does that mean you shouldn't do prayer, fasting, or almsgiving during the season of Lent? Well, not so fast. I think the invitation is to take a purposeful approach when it comes to the faith, as opposed to a strictly legalistic one. A lot of times when we practice the faith, we do it in a strictly legalistic manner, focusing on externals. I do these things because, I don't know why. They're valuable to a certain extent, but they could be a lot more beneficial, a lot more grace-filled. So that's the invitation here, to take a purposeful approach to the faith as opposed to a strictly legalistic one. So to think about the purpose of Lent, what is the purpose of Lent? The whole point of Lent is to look more like Christ at the end of the 40 days. The whole point of Lent is to look more like Christ at the end of the 40 days. Insofar as you look more like Christ at the end of the 40 days, that was a good Lent. Insofar as you don't, that was a bad Lent. Doesn't matter if you lost weight, doesn't matter if you gave up chocolate. If you don't look more like Christ at the end of the season of Lent, it was a bad Lent. Now hold that thought and think about what we typically do. You wake up on Ash Wednesday, oh my gosh, it's Lent. What do I do with prayer, fasting, and almsgiving? You pick something for each category. So, okay, I guess I'll say a couple of prayers every single day. I'll give to my favorite charity, I'll give up chocolate cake, for example. I guess, right? The question you got to ask yourself, though, is that really the best way for you to become more like Christ at the end of the 40 days? If you prayed into it and you thought about it and you came to the conclusion that, yes, that is actually the best way, all power to you, but probably you didn't think about it. Probably you didn't think about it, and instead this is something you decided to do, and at the end, what are you doing? You're simply practicing your faith in a legalistic way as opposed to a purposeful way, right? So you're invited to bring intention and purpose to the table. What is God calling me to do over the course of the 40 days to become more like Him at the end of the season of Lent? Now here's the funny thing. If you do that, if you think about it, you pray into it, what you'll realize is that the Lord calls you to spend more time with Him, to say no to certain things in favor of yes to other things, to build into your life certain habits and structures and routines to keep you in a stance of self-gifts. Because we're all prone to selfishness. But what is that but prayer, fasting, and almsgiving? Right? So is prayer, fasting, and almsgiving legally required? It's not. Prayer, fasting, and almsgiving is not canonically required, but is it important? Yes. Is it necessary? Absolutely. You can't become the person that God wants you to be unless you incorporate into your life prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. It's not just important, it's actually essential. Whether or not we're talking about the season of Lent. So let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you examine your heart and you think, okay, well, the thing that I struggle with perhaps the most right now are sins involving speech. It's a common thing. And I'm not talking about simply like using coarse language. Oftentimes we think about sins against speech in terms of like coarse language. It's more than that, right? So perhaps you might include gossip, rash judgment, lashing out at other people, right? So the question is, what can I do to kind of combat sins against speech? What do people typically do when it comes to sins against speech? I would suggest people simply feel bad. I was impatient with regards to my kids. I see the immediate aftermath of my sin, and I feel bad. Maybe that's followed by a vague resolution to do better and be better in the future. Not entirely useless, but kind of useless. It goes to the notion of what it means to be contrite, right? Contrition is not about feelings. It's not about feeling bad. It's not about being vague. The way it's defined canonically speaking, contrition is having a firm resolution, a firm purpose of amendments. What can I do differently in the future to possibly avoid a similar outcome? When you hear that, it presumes purpose, intention, creativity, a certain application of one's intellect to your particular situation. So you hold that thought and think about the gospel. What does the gospel say with regards to sins against speech? Gospel of Luke chapter 6, the Lord talks about trees. The good tree produces good fruit. The bad tree, not so much. And out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. We've heard that passage so often, it almost sounds cliche, but the Lord is actually articulating something really profound and on point. What he's saying is that don't focus on the fruits. Focus on being a good tree. So, for example, when it comes to sins against speech, don't simply focus on avoiding the commission of bad fruit. Focus on becoming a good tree, because the good tree cannot produce bad fruits. And so therefore, it gives some clarity in terms of the question. It's not simply how can I become more like Christ, because that's kind of vague, that's kind of general. The question is, what am I called to do specifically to become a good tree? Because if you become a good tree, the fruit takes care of itself. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Now let's say you situate the whole thing in terms of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. What might you do? First of all, to pray. It's really important to pray. Maybe that goes without saying, but it's something we tend to forget. Simply by giving your time to Christ, especially before the Lord in the Blessed Sacraments, your heart changes, and therefore you change. Doesn't matter what you're thinking, doesn't matter what's in your hearts. Simply by giving the Lord your time and attention, all these things change. Your heart changes, you change, your perception of life changes, the way you receive people changes. All of a sudden you become more receptive and you're able to see things you couldn't see before simply because you're praying. Now on top of that, imagine that the primary subject of your prayer is gratitude. Not just being polite, but actually having a grateful heart. Gratitude has this enormous power of casting out the darkness. Just think it through, practically speaking. If I'm guilty of sins against speech, it's symptomatic of a certain darkness in my heart. Perhaps I am angry, perhaps I'm bitter, perhaps I'm constantly in a stance of self-pity. So what do I do to combat the darkness? I cultivate the spirit of gratitude, to be grateful for everything. God is constantly blessing you with graces and blessings, especially through people. Do I see that? Do I notice that? Am I grateful for that particular reality? The gift of God given to me through the people I love. Now, with regards to fasting, fasting at its core is like no to this in favor of yes to that. The best way to combat a particular sin is to not simply avoid the sin, but to cultivate the opposite virtue. So no to rage, no to gossip, no to a certain vengefulness, no to rash judgments. But yes to what? Yes to encouragement. Yes to affirmation. This is something I encourage people to do all the time, whether or not we're talking about a season of Lent. You wake up and you think about the people in your life. To not simply avoid being mean, but to cultivate this notion of encouragement and affirmation. To ask yourself the question, like, what can I say to the people around me, the people that I love, to encourage them, to affirm them, to let them know that you're valuable to me and I love you, you're a gift. To build that into our regular routine. Final thing with regards to almsgiving, to not think of it in terms of like cash, but time and attention. To what do I give my time? To what do I give my attention? So maybe what you do is you simply waste time with the people you love. Quality time with your family and with your friends. To celebrate what? Nothing really, just our relationship. Now you hear all those things. Imagine you worked on those things throughout the season of Lent. Words of affirmation, encouragement, gratitude, quality time. You might think, well, gosh, that sounds like it's cheating. Shouldn't Lent be difficult? Shouldn't Lent be hard? A couple words about that. The thing about the cross is that you don't need to go looking for it. The cross will come looking for you. Don't you worry about that. And that's the thing about Lent. You may bring to the table a certain sense of purpose and intention, but the Lord knows your heart better than you know it yourself. As a result, what will happen, you'll go through Lent, and then all of a sudden Lent is challenging and difficult, and you encounter difficult and painful circumstances and people, and you're thinking to yourself, well, what's wrong? The Lord is using all that stuff to uncover these things in your heart and to bring to a place of healing. So don't worry about looking for the cross. The cross will come looking for you. Lent will be challenging and difficult and painful. Don't worry about that. The other thing, though, I want to suggest to you is that it goes to our original point, right? The whole point of Lent is to look more like Christ at the end of the 40 days. And if you think about it, pray into it, and you realize, well, gosh, the thing I'm meant to do, the thing I'm called to do, is to spend quality time with the people I love and go to a way of encouragement and celebration and rejoicing in each other's presence. Well, then by God, do that. Because it accomplishes the end in a way which is arguably a lot more productive than simply giving up chocolate cake.